prison should be a place not of first resort, but of last resort. And there are many other ways I think you can deal with offenders other than cutting them off from the world.
Prisons have become warehouses of our social problems. What we are doing in this country currently is sending people to prison, many of whom are victims themselves, many of whom have been bullied and will continue to be bullied in prisons.
I think prison needs to be reserved for Britain's most dangerous offenders. It shouldn't become a big private industry that trades on people's misery. It shouldn't be an alternative welfare state where the vulnerable, the mentally ill and the illiterate founder away for years on end with no hope of any real rehabilitation.
With people with learning difficulties, there's definitely no help there in courts, and I've been in quite a few of them. You know.
My first time in prison was actually the same as Danny's. I was down for non-payment of fine. But of course it wasn't told me properly, or I couldn't understand properly about payment of fines. My learning disability was late diagnosed as well. I didn't know I had a learning disability when I was going through most of the criminal justice system.
We need to look at ways of stopping kids that commit petty crimes, going to prison and then going on to become lifetime criminals. I was brought up in an estate in North London. Like, you were surrounded by people that had no aspirations. And I went to university, I went to LSE, and I was surrounded by people that knew they wanted to work for Goldman Sachs since they were 10. People where I'm from have never heard of Goldman Sachs, and just stuff like that, just information available to kids that you don't have to go down that path, you can go down this path.
For 40 years I've been involved with a day centre which works with young homeless people in central London, and for them prison simply does not work. Of course, when you have a young person in complete crisis, nowhere to go, family rejection, no local authority involvement, very often prison's a fantastic dumping place, but it's amazingly expensive, and of course it pollutes the young person. They come into contact with extremely dangerous individuals, but I've never really seen any young person go to jail and come out of it a better individual.
The most dangerous people, criminals who commit serious crimes, once convicted, should be locked up for the safety of the citizens we are charged with protecting. But I think at the other end of the equation, the majority, the overwhelming majority of people we deal with who are convicted benefit from sentences which are not custodial. The evidence is clear, especially around young people, where they are given sentences, sanctions that are within the community against which they have offended. The chances of a long-term successful outcome are far higher.
There are alternatives, and these are being demonstrated in other countries, but we seem so fascinated, obsessed with locking people up in this country from a very early age, and for quite minor offences, that we lose sight of the fact that prisons should be for serious offenders, and only that justifies the expense.
We would like to see wider use of alternatives to custody so that we can tackle reoffending behaviour and help offenders rehabilitate themselves.
The judge's job is to do everything possible to avoid sending somebody who's been convicted of a crime to prison. There are all sorts of alternatives to prison that the judge can use, provided that the offence is not so serious that prison is the only answer.
Is prison the answer? Well, for some of the people I see in prison, if prison's the answer, it seems to me we're not asking the right questions. When I see people who are mentally disordered, seriously self-harming, some of the children and young people I see in prison, it's quite clear that whatever their problem is, prison is likely to make it worse rather than better.
I've committed somewhere in the region of probably 20,000 crimes in my life and spent 18.5 years of my life in prison. Prison never worked for me, restorative justice did.
I'm Will Riley, I'm Peter's last victim. I did find Peter in my house, I caught him, he was convicted, and I saw him again 6 weeks later under restorative justice. And I met him and I told him what I thought about it, the whole process. And I was able to completely get rid of the trauma of being a victim.
To meet a victim face to face for the first time ever just is something, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, yet the most rewarding.
At the moment we have a detected reoffending rate of those who go through the criminal justice system into prison and out the other end. And that can't be right. We're wasting our time as police officers actually dealing with those people again and again. And so the question I ask politicians is, how many times do you want us to arrest offenders before they're dealt with effectively in what is at the moment a failing criminal justice system and prison in particular?
Your perennial problem is why we feel that comparatively minor offenders, comparatively minor shoplifting, for instance, is a non-violent crime, I suppose. Why should they be penalised with prison? Why are we putting so many people in prison that maybe could be dealt with in a more creative way?